Gertrude Stein was an American icon and a complex figure who became one of the most influential writers and cultural forces of the 20th century. Gertrude Stein, modernist writer, art collector, and intellectual pioneer, was born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania on February 3, 1874. She came from a prosperous German-Jewish immigrant family. She had a distinctive personality marked by fierce intelligence and an unshakable confidence in her own genius. Stein's early years were marked by privilege, but also by a sense of not quite fitting into conventional society. Her father, Daniel Stein, was a wealthy businessman who made his fortune in real estate and streetcar franchises. The family was comfortable, living well and traveling extensively. Young Gertrude, as she was called, learned early that intellectual pursuits were valued and that she had a mind capable of grasping complex ideas. When Gertrude was 17 years old, tragedy struck the Stein family. Her father died, followed shortly by her mother's death 2 years earlier. Gertrude and her siblings were left orphaned but financially secure. Her older brother Michael managed the family investments, ensuring that Gertrude would never have to worry about money. This financial independence would shape her entire life. She never had to work for a living, yet she would go on to produce a body of work that would influence generations of writers and artists. The freedom from financial pressure gave her the liberty to experiment and create without regard for commercial success or popular approval. Stein attended Radcliffe College, the women's annex of Harvard University, where she studied psychology and philosophy. She was a student of William James, the pioneering psychologist and philosopher who became one of the most important influences on her thinking. James encouraged her intellectual ambitions and recognized her unusual mind. She excelled in her studies, particularly in experimental psychology, and even assisted James in his research. Her work with James introduced her to concepts of consciousness, stream of thought, and the nature of human perception that would later influence her revolutionary writing style. After graduating from Radcliffe in 1897, Stein enrolled at Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore. She was one of the few women admitted to the program, and for 3 years she studied medicine with the intention of becoming a doctor. But medicine did not capture her imagination the way psychology and philosophy had. She was more interested in the workings of the mind than the mechanics of the body. She also became involved in an intense and complicated romantic relationship with another woman, which caused her emotional turmoil and distraction from her studies. In her 4th year, she deliberately failed her courses and left medical school without completing her degree. It was a turning point. She had decided that her future lay not in medicine but in writing. In 1903, Stein made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She moved to Paris, France, joining her brother Leo, who was already living there. Paris at the turn of the century was the center of the art world, a place where new ideas flourished and traditional forms were being challenged and overthrown. Gertrude and Leo set up residence at 27 Rue de Fleuris, an apartment that would become one of the most famous addresses in modern cultural history. The Steins began collecting art, purchasing works by unknown or barely known artists whose radical new styles appealed to their taste for innovation. They bought paintings by Paul Cézanne, Henri Matisse, and Pablo Picasso when these artists were still struggling and unrecognized. The Saturday evening gatherings at 27 Rue de Fleuris became legendary. Artists, writers, and intellectuals would crowd into the apartment to see the extraordinary collection of modern art covering the walls, and to engage in intense discussions about art, literature, and ideas. Gertrude presided over these salons like a Buddha, sitting in a large chair and holding forth on art and literature with absolute authority. She had a commanding presence despite her short, stocky build and her plain features. People were drawn to her intelligence, her confidence, and her willingness to engage with radical new ideas. In 1907, Stein met Alice B. Toklas, a fellow American who had come to Paris. The meeting changed both their lives. Alice became Gertrude's companion, lover, secretary, and wife in all but legal name. Their relationship would last until Gertrude's death nearly 40 years later. Alice moved into the Rue de Fleuris apartment, and she and Leo established an arrangement where Alice handled all the domestic details of Gertrude's life, freeing her to focus entirely on her writing. Alice typed Gertrude's manuscripts, managed the household, and dealt with visitors and correspondence. She was completely devoted to Gertrude and to promoting her work. The relationship was both conventional and radical. In their domestic roles, Gertrude was the genius who worked while Alice cooked and managed the home. But the very existence of their openly lesbian relationship in early 20th century society was a quiet form of rebellion. Stein had been writing since her arrival in Paris, but her work was unlike anything being published. She was attempting to do with words what the Cubist painters were doing with images, breaking down conventional forms and reassembling them in new ways. Her early novel, 3 Lives, published in 1909, told the stories of 3 working-class women in a prose style that was deceptively simple but radically innovative. She used repetition, present-tense narration, and a focus on the continuous present moment that challenged traditional narrative structure. The book received little attention when it was published, but it established the techniques that would characterize all her later work. Stein's most famous work from this period was The Making of Americans, a massive novel that she worked on from 1903 to 1911. The book was over 900 pages long and attempted to describe every possible type of human being. It used extreme repetition and variation, with sentences and phrases repeated with slight modifications page after page. The effect was hypnotic and maddening, brilliant and unreadable. The book was not published in full until 1925, and even then it found almost no readers. But Stein believed it was her masterpiece, a complete theory of human psychology expressed through prose rhythm and repetition. During the 1910s, Stein's writing became increasingly experimental and difficult. She wrote pieces like Tender Buttons, published in 1914, which consisted of prose poems about objects, food, and rooms. Writing was abstract, playful, and often incomprehensible. Words were chosen for their sound and rhythm rather than their meaning. Grammar and syntax were twisted and broken. She was treating language as a plastic medium, something to be shaped and molded for its own sake rather than as a transparent vehicle for meaning. Critics and readers were baffled and often hostile. They accused her of charlatanism, of writing nonsense and calling it art. But Stein was utterly confident in what she was doing. She believed she was capturing the essence of things, the immediate experience of consciousness, in a way that conventional language could not. Her work influenced a generation of younger writers who recognized in her experiments a liberation from traditional forms. World War I disrupted the life of the Parisian art world. When war broke out in 1914, Stein and Toklas were visiting England. They returned to Paris and stayed through the early months of the war before leaving for Spain. They spent most of the war years in Mallorca, returning to Paris in 1916. Stein wanted to contribute to the war effort, and she and Alice volunteered with the American Fund for French Wounded. They drove a Ford van which they named Auntie, delivering supplies to French hospitals. Stein, who had learned to drive only recently, navigated the difficult roads of wartime France with the same confidence she brought to everything else. She and Alice became familiar figures at field hospitals, and Stein enjoyed the activity and the sense of purpose. The experience gave her material for later writing and reinforced her identification with American practical energy and competence. After the war, Paris became the gathering place for a generation of young American writers who came to Europe seeking artistic freedom and inspiration. Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sherwood Anderson, and many others found their way to Gertrude Stein's salon. She became a mentor and mother figure to these young men, offering advice, criticism, and encouragement. Hemingway in particular became close to Stein, visiting frequently and showing her his early work. Stein recognized his talent and encouraged him, though she also criticized what she saw as his limitations. She famously told him that remarks are not literature, pushing him toward a more concentrated and disciplined prose style. She also coined the term lost generation to describe Hemingway and his contemporaries, writers who had been shaped by the war and were searching for meaning in its aftermath. Stein's relationship with these younger writers was complicated. She was generous with her time and attention, but she also demanded recognition of her own genius and priority. She believed that she had invented the modern prose style that writers like Hemingway were using, and she expected acknowledgement of her influence. When the younger writers achieved commercial success and fame while her own work remained largely unread, she felt a mixture of pride and resentment. Her friendships with Hemingway and others eventually soured as the younger writers established their own reputations and grew less willing to defer to her authority. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Stein continued to write prolifically, producing plays, poems, novels, and essays. Almost none of it was published or reached a significant audience. She had a few devoted admirers and supporters, but the general public and most critics dismissed her work as incomprehensible nonsense. She published small editions of her work through private presses, often paying for publication herself. She gave lectures and readings to small audiences. She maintained her absolute confidence that she was a genius whose importance would eventually be recognized. This confidence was both admirable and maddening to those around her. She seemed impervious to criticism or doubt, convinced that posterity would vindicate her experiments. In 1933, Stein achieved the popular success that had eluded her for 3 decades. She published the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, a book that purported to be Alice's memoir but was actually written by Gertrude. The book told the story of their life together in Paris, the artists and writers they had known, and the development of modern art and literature. It was written in a clear, accessible, entertaining style completely unlike her experimental work. The book was funny, gossipy, and full of memorable anecdotes about Picasso, Matisse, Hemingway, and the other luminaries of the Paris art world. It became a bestseller, was serialized in the Atlantic Monthly, and made Stein famous at age 59. Suddenly she was a celebrity, recognized on the street and sought after for interviews and appearances. The success was sweet but also ironic. She had achieved fame not through her experimental masterpieces, but through a conventional memoir written in a style she had long since abandoned. Following the success of the autobiography, Stein and Toklas made a triumphant lecture tour of America in 1934 and 1935. It was Stein's first return to her native country in over 30 years. She gave lectures at universities, museums, and literary societies across the country. She was interviewed by journalists, photographed, and treated as a major literary figure. She spoke about her writing, about modern art, and about her theories of literature. She enjoyed the attention and the recognition, though she was also critical of many aspects of American culture. She found America more materialistic and less intellectually serious than she remembered, but she also appreciated its energy and optimism. The lecture tour was exhausting but exhilarating, and it confirmed her status as an important cultural figure. Stein and Toklas had settled into a comfortable routine in Paris, dividing their time between the Rue de Fleuris apartment and a country house they rented in the village of Balignan in the south of France. The country house became increasingly important to them as they grew older. They spent summers and long stretches there, enjoying the quiet rural life, the garden, and the landscape. Stein wrote every day, usually in the morning, sitting in the garden or at a table indoors. Alice managed the household, cooked elaborate meals, and maintained the domestic order that allowed Gertrude to focus on her work. They entertained visitors, took walks, and lived a life that was both bohemian and remarkably domestic and settled. When World War II began in 1939, Stein and Toklas were at their country house in Balignan. They were both Jewish and American, which made them vulnerable under the Nazi occupation of France. Friends urged them to return to America, but Stein refused to leave. France was her home, and she could not imagine living anywhere else. When Germany invaded France in 1940, their situation became dangerous. The Vichy government that collaborated with the Nazis enacted anti-Jewish laws, and foreign Jews were particularly at risk. Stein and Toklas should have been deported or sent to concentration camps. That they survived the war was due to a combination of luck, the protection of local friends, and possibly the intervention of Bernard Fay, a Vichy official who was a friend and admirer of Stein's work. The details remain murky and controversial. They lived quietly in Balignan throughout the war, growing vegetables, dealing with shortages, and keeping a low profile. Stein continued to write, producing a novel about the occupation called Wars I Have Seen. The fact that two elderly Jewish women survived the Nazi occupation in rural France when millions of others perished remains one of the troubling mysteries of Stein's biography. After the liberation of France in 1944, Stein and Toklas returned to Paris. Their apartment had been occupied during the war, but remarkably their art collection had survived intact, protected by friends and by the concierge of their building. Stein was now 70 years old and her health was beginning to fail, but she enjoyed the attention and gratitude of American soldiers who had read her work or heard of her reputation. She welcomed GIs to her apartment, talking with them and signing books. She wrote about the liberation and about her experiences during the war. She worked on a final opera libretto with the composer Virgil Thomson. She remained intellectually active and engaged, still confident in her own importance and still writing every day. In July 1946, Stein began experiencing severe abdominal pain. She was diagnosed with stomach cancer that had already spread extensively. Surgery was attempted, but the cancer was too advanced. On July 27, 1946, Gertrude Stein died at the American hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine, just outside Paris. She was 72 years old. According to Alice, her last words were a question and an answer. As she was being wheeled into the operating room, she asked, "What is the answer?" When no one responded, she said, "In that case, what is the question?" Then she lost consciousness and died. The story may be apocryphal, but it perfectly captured Stein's lifelong preoccupation with language, meaning, and the nature of understanding. She was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. Alice would join her there 21 years later, their names inscribed together on the same headstone. Stein's legacy is that of a radical innovator whose influence extended far beyond her limited readership. She challenged every assumption about how language could be used in literature. She treated words as objects, as sounds, as rhythms, rather than as transparent carriers of meaning. She influenced poets, novelists, and playwrights who came after her, even those who never read her most experimental work. Her ideas about the continuous present, about repetition and variation, about capturing immediate experience rather than narrating sequential events, changed how writers thought about their craft. Modern and postmodern literature would be unthinkable without her experiment. Writers as diverse as William Carlos Williams, John Ashbery, and the language poets acknowledged her influence. She was also important as a cultural figure, as a woman who lived openly with another woman, as an American expatriate who helped define modernism, as a collector and promoter of modern art. The salon at Rue de Fleuris was where modernism was born, where Picasso and Matisse met writers and intellectuals, where the conversations that shaped 20th century culture took place. Modern critics and scholars remain divided about Stein's work. Some consider her one of the most important writers of the century, a radical innovator whose experiments opened new possibilities for literature. Others view her as a talented charlatan whose difficult and often unreadable prose was more about self-promotion than genuine artistic achievement. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Stein was genuinely experimental and innovative, pushing language to its limits and beyond. She was also self-absorbed, convinced of her own genius in ways that sometimes blinded her to the legitimate difficulties her work presented to readers. She demanded that readers meet her on her own terms, without compromise or explanation. This uncompromising stance was both her strength and her limitation. Perhaps the most important thing about Gertrude Stein was her absolute confidence in her own vision. In an era when women writers were expected to be modest and conventional, she proclaimed herself a genius and demanded recognition. She lived exactly as she chose, with the person she loved, pursuing her art without regard for commercial success or popular approval. She created a life that was entirely her own, shaped by her values and her vision. This courage and independence inspired generations of writers and artists, particularly women and LGBTQ individuals who saw in her example a model of how to live authentically and create boldly. Stein's relationship with Alice Toklas was central to her life and work. Alice provided the domestic stability and emotional support that allowed Gertrude to focus entirely on her writing. Their relationship lasted nearly 40 years and was by all accounts deeply loving and committed. In an era when same-sex relationships had to be hidden or coded, Stein and Toklas lived openly together, and their relationship was accepted by their friends and community. They represented a different model of domestic life, one based on mutual devotion and shared purpose rather than conventional gender roles, even as they paradoxically maintained very traditional divisions of labor within their household. Stein's influence on American literature extended beyond her writing to her role as mentor and cultural arbiter. The young writers who gathered at her salon learned not just from her advice but from her example. She showed them that it was possible to be uncompromising in one's art, to experiment radically, to trust one's own vision even when the world was skeptical or hostile. Hemingway's spare, concentrated prose style owed much to Stein's emphasis on the weight and rhythm of individual words. Sherwood Anderson's experiments with repetition and simple language reflected her influence. Even writers who rejected or moved beyond her influence had to contend with the questions she raised about the nature and possibilities of literary language. In the end, Gertrude Stein was neither a perfect person nor an easy writer to read, but rather an extraordinary individual who lived an extraordinary life. Her legacy includes her experimental writing, her promotion of modern art, and her model of how to live as an independent woman and artist. She's remembered today as a central figure of literary modernism and as a symbol of artistic courage and innovation. Her life spanned an era of incredible change, from the Victorian 19th century to the Atomic Age, from conventional realism to abstract expressionism. She participated in that transformation and helped create it. Stein was in death as in life a figure of controversy and importance, remembered for her experiments, her confidence, and her unwavering belief in the value of her own vision.